I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everybody, remind everybody as well that we still have 1 week open for sponsorship next week for those who on a special occasion would like to become part of this. Obviously the history lectures are free, but those who contribute help make it more possible for Dr. Abramson and the Shul. And also a special invitation to those who are around this Sunday. We've all been to City Field for many adventures. This Sunday will be an opportunity to join us for another adventure with Torah NY. We're going to be joining with the OU program. Dr. Abramson will be there in presenting on his new program, which will be launching on Alda. I will also be there speaking at the same time as on Sunday morning. Really, it's an opportunity to take a moment to celebrate Torah. Once again, thank you everybody for joining us this evening. And thank you, Dr. Abramson, for really giving it his all to uplift our week and inspire our lives.
Thank you, Rabbi. I appreciate that very much. Very kind. Okay, thank you so much for coming to this third of 4 lectures, crash course in Jewish history. I've received a lot of interesting feedback for the first 2 lectures. Most of it was pretty positive. I think my favorite criticism was, couldn't you just spend a little bit more time talking about this or talking about this different subject? But the whole point of a crash course is to try and compress a massive amount of information into this short, condensed period of time. But it does remind me of a joke where 2 guys are standing outside a deli in Lower East Side, and one of them says to the other, "This restaurant serves the worst food." And the other guy says, "Yeah, and really small portions too." So we're still going to keep with that rather audacious and ambitious goal of completing all of Jewish history from time immemorial to the present day within 4 short lectures. Tonight we're going to be concentrating on the modern period. And you'll recall some of these periodizations, these seams that we're going to draw in history are somewhat arbitrary, but I'd like to specifically call the modern period the era from the Spanish expulsion. As we shall see, that huge demographic upheaval had a phenomenal impact on the entire Jewish population of the world at the time, and we'll take it up to the end of the 19th century with the pogroms of 1881, which also sparked a massive Great Migration and also had phenomenal impact on the contemporary period, which will be the last lecture, God willing, next week, when we'll look essentially at the 20th century and the very complex and difficult processes that happened at that time. So let us not take too much time. Let's go straight to the material. Here's the map that we ended with last week. It shows you the tremendous dispersal from the Iberian Peninsula at the end of the 15th century. Tremendous upheaval. We're talking about the largest, most settled, most concentrated, most prestigious Jewish community in the world suddenly being uprooted and spread throughout the entire Mediterranean basin and also to points north in Europe and even to the New World. This was an upheaval that is very difficult for us to imagine, but I hope to show you a couple of parallels shortly. And there are some tremendously heart-wrenching stories that are associated with this expulsion. I do not have time to go into them in great detail, but just try to imagine what it must have been like if you think of the entire population of the 5 boroughs of New York, all the Jews living there suddenly being forced to leave within a few short weeks and find homes elsewhere. I know a lot would go to Lakewood, let's say, but Lakewood also will fill up. And after Lakewood, where do you go? Incredibly difficult and heart-wrenching stories. Let's look at some of the major changes that happened as a result. There's a huge amount of social, intellectual, and cultural change that happens as a result of this dispersal. One of the things that I find most fascinating, and we'll be able to draw a couple of lines of continuity through the next few centuries, is that there is a dramatic shift in terms of gender power during the post-expulsion period. Since so many of the entrenched authorities, which were overwhelmingly and continued to be predominantly male, since many of them had been uprooted from their sources in the Iberian Peninsula, there was suddenly a lot more possibility for women to take positions of authority. And we see two of the most dramatic examples of it with the next generation of survivors of the upheaval. Specifically, on the left, you see a representation of Doña Gracia Mendez Nasi, who was a so-called Portuguese Jew. What this term Portuguese refers to, incidentally, I'm sure you've heard of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, which is a very common designation. There was a Jewish population in Portugal before 1492, not an especially large one, but what happened is, if we just go back to this map for a second, you see that the most natural route for expellees from Spain to take would be the overland route over the Pyrenees into France, and many Jews did go there, or simply to the west into Portugal here, which of course has a similar culture, different language, but this has been a homeland for oppressed Jews who fled Spanish conversion, such as, for example, the famous Abarbanel's grandfather, who was forcibly converted and fled to Portugal, and there he resumed his Jewish identity. So Portugal is a natural route of escape. This is one of those famous times where Jews were literally undocumented migrants and were held up at the border. There are a lot of parallels to our contemporary situation. And when they arrived in Portugal, there were certain allowances made for them, but ultimately they were forcibly converted 5 years later in 1497. The imposition was then brought into the Portuguese country as well, and many Jews, like in Spain, just went underground as so-called Marranos, hiding their Jewish identity for generations in order to escape the wrath of the Inquisition. And only later, as in the case of Doña Gracia, they finally were able to leave Portugal, and the oppression is hard even to imagine. I mean, the Inquisition actually kept tabs on people. When you went, for example, to England, we have trials from Inquisition transcripts of the Inquisition's trials of people, Jews who went to England and there experimented with Judaism, and when they returned to Portugal, they were arrested and they were asked as to what exactly you did in England. So they were really quite paranoid about hunting them down. But Doña Gracia was one of these women who, when she got out of the clutches of the Inquisition, she said, "I'm actually Jewish, not Christian at all." And these Jews who were forcibly converted, or their grandchildren or great-grandchildren, were called Portuguese Jews. By contrast, you have Benvenida Abravanel, who was a niece of the famous Don Isaac Abravanel, who fled in 1492 and was never converted forcibly to Christianity, and so therefore she was called a Spanish Jew. Now, the two of them were actually two of the most powerful women in the world, and at one point they came to clash over an international boycott placed against the church because of their treatment of Jews. It's an incredible story that we don't have time to talk about in great detail. But what is one small detail I will point out, neither of these pictures are accurate. The one on the left is actually Doña Gracia Mendez's niece. A medallion was struck for her. And on the right is a non-Jewish woman, Leonora of Toledo, I believe, who was actually Benvenida Abravanel's student. We don't have pictures of the two of them in reality, but it's not that unusual for devoted students to choose to portray themselves as their teacher. Like, for example, many of my students like to use this picture to represent me, what they often use. It reminds them of me or something like that. Okay. Moving on, so one of the things that changed as a result of the Spanish Inquisition was that suddenly there's a power vacuum. The traditional power elites are disjointed, are dislocated, and many other people can begin to take up the position. Similarly, there is a lot of erosion to traditional religious authority, because after all, although there were many heroic figures like Abravanel, who I mentioned more than once now, there were many religious leaders who simply capitulated. Abraham Senior, who was in his 80s and was the senior financial advisor to Queen Isabella, decided that he would rather stay in Spain and convert, and he did with his entire family, decided to remain in Spain and simply give up. And these were rabbis, so there was a tremendous lack of of appreciation for rabbinic leadership at this time as well that eroded traditional authorities. And as a result, there were new secular ideas that were circulating with much greater frequency and authority. Perhaps the most tragic of the figures associated with this is Uriel Acosta, who is pictured here in this fanciful image with he's the dark, this skull-capped man with kind of a serious gaze, and on his knee is Baruch Spinoza, also a product of the Inquisition, but quite a bit later. They never actually met, but this is kind of like a metaphorical. Spinoza is on the knee of Acosta. Acosta's story is very tragic. I'll just tell it to you very quickly as an example of the secularism of the time. He was raised as a Christian by his mother, who hid their Jewish identity. By the way, women also had a phenomenal role in perpetuating Judaism under these incredibly difficult circumstances. We have a lot of documentation of women, particularly who were taken before the Inquisition, who describe the many vehicles by which they maintained their identity and their memory of Judaism, including, for example, self-scarification, where if they had a male child and they were unable, obviously, to circumcise that child, they would cut a small amount of flesh out of their upper arm to remind them that if they were ever able to, they should one day circumcise their son. Phenomenal types of self-sacrifice. Acosta's mother revealed to him as an adolescent that he was in fact Jewish. They couldn't say this to children because then they would go to the playground and say, oh, my mother just told me we actually like gefilte fish and egg rolls, and that could be it for them with the Inquisition. So Acosta learned he was Jewish when he was a teenager, was thrilled, couldn't wait. He was so excited. They managed to gain passage to Amsterdam, which was, unlike today, a very liberal city with very relaxed laws. That's a joke. I was hoping some of you would get it. No, I guess it didn't work, but okay. And there, when he got to Amsterdam, he said, okay, I'm Jewish. I'm totally out of the religious closet, so to speak. And he embraced Judaism with tremendous enthusiasm, but he was quite disappointed because when he went to shul, he would say to people, excuse me, isn't that Lashon Hara that you're saying? And wait a second, this is Shabbos. How can you be talking about business? And he was very upset with the fact that the image he had of Jews did not conform with the reality of actual Jewish people that he met. He ended up, because he was a bit of a rabble-rouser and a highly intelligent individual, he actually published books, he was excommunicated 3 times from the community. And he came back every time begging for forgiveness. He could not live on his own until finally, in the 3rd excommunication, that the Jewish synagogue, again, fearing the possible repercussions of having these kinds of atheistic or challenging elements in our community, they said, listen, we've done this before, so before you can be readmitted into the community, we are going to go through a symbolic humiliation, where, among other things, you will be symbolically whipped in the synagogue, actually lashed, and it was, with light cords, merely it was more for the symbol than actually the pain. And then he would have to lie down in front of the synagogue steps, and every member of the community would walk over his prone body into the synagogue. Deeply humiliated, he went through the process, he went home, he wrote an 11-page suicide note and shot himself. And we have that suicide note called Exemplar Humanae Vitae. It's a chilling, terrifying document that is a testament as well to the upheaval of the Inquisition and what it means for trying to re-enter the Jewish community after being so far away from it. But this kind of secular thinking that Acosta brought to the table definitely influenced thinkers like Spinoza later and had centuries of impact. This is, we shall recall, about 75 years after the expulsion, and we are, if you want to just put it in your minds a little bit, we're about 75 years after the Holocaust. So the kind of feelings that we have about recovering after such a devastating demographic assault on the community, they would be things that Portuguese Jews would have felt as well at that time. But let us move forward. One more detail that's kind of interesting for us here that relates to the expulsion is that there was a small group of Portuguese Jews who fled to the New World, and they settled in a little island called Recife in the Brazilian holdings that were under Portugal. And then at one point, briefly, in the 1650s, the island of Recife was handed over to the Dutch, who were much more liberal. And so all of these nominally Christian Portuguese came out of the closet and said, hooray, now finally we can celebrate our Jewish identity. And then the Portuguese got the island back again. And all of a sudden, they had revealed their true Jewish identities, and they were no longer welcome in Recife. So they got into a boat, they made their way to another Dutch territory, to New Amsterdam, and they landed in Manhattan Island, and that's how we have the first Jews here in New York. And you can see there's a straight line drawn straight to us, and in fact, we can go right in, and there's us right now. Isn't that amazing? Okay, so the Spanish Inquisition has tremendous impact on the role of genders in Judaism. It has a tremendous impact on the intellectual and secularization of Judaism, and it has great impact, of course, on the demographic movement of Jews. Now, I would like to point out one fascinating population movement to a small city called Tzfat, or Safed in English, which of course I'm sure many of you visited. It's in northern Israel. It's a beautiful, beautiful place, which was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time. This is one of those ironies we mentioned last week, that for most of Jewish history since the 7th century, by and large, Jews tended to be received with greater hospitality in Islamic countries than in Christian countries. There are obviously exceptions to that rule. There are moments of violence and forced conversions in the Muslim world as well, but on the whole, it's very clear that the Muslim experience was generally better for Jews. One of those examples is the Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan, when he heard about Spain evicting all its Jews, he literally laughed, and he published proclamations saying, I want all those Jews, please come to Constantinople. He knew that Jews were literate, numerate, that they, as a minority, tend to be very law-abiding, that they contributed to societies, and he welcomed Jews whenever possible. One of those places where he welcomed Jews was in the northern Israel territory, where Tzfat was being settled at the time, and he gave them tax advantages, particularly in the textile trade, so there was a new population of Jews, primarily Spanish and Portuguese citizens moving in. Here's a map that shows you where Tzfat is, and there was like a moment, a phenomenal spiritual explosion occurred in Tzfat at this time, where you had this incredible, gathering of minds, most of whom were first and second generation refugees from Spain, but they included people like the author of the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, the great commentator, the Alshich, the Alkabetz, who composed Lecha Dodi. It was, if you can imagine, it's like living in the 5 towns and having a Nobel Prize winner on every other block. It was a phenomenal, brief concentration for about 60 years of incredible minds. Perhaps the most famous of them was the Arizal, who was actually not one of the expellees from the Iberian Peninsula. He was from Egypt, but he was attracted there because of the presence of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who I'll talk about in a second. The Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, created a new mystical vision of Judaism that capitalized on the experience of Spanish Jews by injecting into traditional Kabbalah a note of drama that was unparalleled. The Arizal taught essentially that the world has been broken, that the world is in desperate need of tikkun, right? You've heard the phrase tikkun olam. The world needs human intervention, and that God has placed within the very fabric of creation a requirement for human action. This lent to the Kabbalah of the Arizal a tremendous impetus that anyone who came in contact with felt empowered, energized, and even the tiniest little action because of the cosmic significance that it carried. And the jolt of energy that the Arizal gave to Judaism in the post-expulsion period was incomparable. It was one of the most salient elements in the growth of Hasidism some 200 years later, very, very heavily reliant on the Arizal. Let me also note his teacher. He came because of the presence of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. Here's a plug for one of my books, The Kabbalah of Forgiveness. This is, I mean, I wish I could talk about this because it occupied so much of my mind for maybe a decade. The Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, known by the acronym Ramak, was a brilliant teacher. He was Portuguese. His name is actually Cordoero, but people pronounce it Cordovero by mistake. And he wrote, among other things, this glorious book. And the first chapter is, in my humble opinion, one of the greatest works of spirituality ever written in any religious tradition. He basically talks about the Yud Gimel Midos of Rachamim, the 13 varieties of forgiveness that God extends to the world, which is a long, well-known theological concept. And he says that if God has created the world in such a manner in which the very first element of his thought is these 13 varieties of forgiveness, then we must, and you can see the parallel with the Arizal, his student, we must emulate that. And he describes 13 different ways to bring forgiveness into your life. Actual practical ways, including, there are lines like, this is especially helpful with your wife, things like that. And it's a brilliant book that has a soaring, glorious spiritual content, and it's brought down to the very pragmatic how to actually forgive people that irritate you. It is one of the rare works of Kabbalah that has been long considered a book that is accessible to anyone, as people who are not learned in Kabbalah, people under the age of 40, women, and is traditionally studied right now at this month of Elul as we prepare to go into the holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Okay, there's a plug for the book, but it gives you a sense of Tzfat. Tzfat was one of those places where these Jews landed after the expulsion, and they created something absolutely amazing. It all died out in the end of the 16th century. There was a series of earthquakes and plagues, and the community never quite got anywhere near that high pitch, although today it is especially known as a haven for Kabbalists, modern-day Kabbalists, and for artists, and so on. Okay, so let us move to one more aspect of the 16th century, and then we're going to do basically 1 century every 10 minutes. The 16th century was a period of tremendous technological revolution as well. And I wish I had more time to speak about the scientific revolution and its impact on Jews, but I'll look at one aspect of it. I would like to remind you that the great eras of change in Jewish history are almost always associated with technological innovation as well. For example, in the ancient period, of course, we have the Torah. That's a huge change that differentiates the Jews from the various peoples of the ancient Near East. And then in the medieval period, under tremendous strain because of the conflict with Rome, the Jews moved from an oral culture to a text culture, to a written culture, with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's fateful decision to actually write down the Mishnah. We spoke about that in the first lecture. In the period we're talking about now, that manuscript culture transitions to a print culture with the advent of printing. Jews were early adopters of Gutenberg's press. They thought it was absolutely fantastic because all of a sudden the Jews, who were very literate people, the people of the book after all, they said it makes total sense that we should be mass producing these works which suddenly extend the world of ideas to a much broader audience by lowering the threshold of participation. The cost changes radically. And as Clay Shirky, a very brilliant New York University researcher of the meaning of the internet, writes, more is different. Once more information is available, society changes to match that. We will see that more, God willing, next week when we talk about the impact of the internet on the Jewish world, in particular the study of the Talmud. One interesting detail about this period, when the Talmud begins to be printed, that's one of the most amazing changes of this period, because the Talmud is such a huge and expensive document, very hard to get the full set of 20-odd volumes. Most really important yeshivas only had 2 or 3 Masechtas, and they would share them, and it was because these are handwritten manuscripts. When they become printed, all of a sudden, every Tom, Dick, and Harry, every Jonathan, David, and Hillel has his own. I should say it like that. I'll forget. I enjoyed that. But one of the most interesting and influential people in creating this was none other than a non-Jew named Daniel Bomberg. And I'll show you one of his most famous contributions. This is a page from one of the earliest Talmuds ever printed by the famous Sonsino family in Italy. And does anyone in the audience notice what's missing? No, Rashi's there on the inside. It's the page numbers, thank you. Some of you read the JTA. They didn't think of putting page numbers because you don't need page numbers on codices. And they said, oh my gosh, what do we do with this? So Daniel Bomberg, who was, again, a Christian printer who just saw, hey, Jews love books. This is new printing. I can get these books printed and I'll make a lot of money. He printed the first Talmud that had page numbers. And it was like a revolution. Literally, he put the daf in Daf Yomi, right? It would not be there without it. And of course, the question is, why does the Talmud begin with the page 2? There are a lot of beautiful things that rabbi types like to say, but really it started with page 2 because page 1 was traditionally the title page. Because they were just inventing pagination at the time, they're making their way around it. They said, okay, here's the first page, is the title, and then you turn the page, the first page of text is actually the second page. Okay. So that's one of the major standards. Now let's move kind of 1 century per circle with the remaining time we have. When we get into the 17th century, it's a period of tremendous upheaval. If we move towards the east, you'll recall last week we discussed there were 2 phenomena that began to push Jews towards what was then Poland and Lithuania, the largest country, the largest, state unit in Europe at the time. One was increasing anti-Semitism in the West. This is the period when the blood libel was becoming very prominent, the charge of desecration of the host and so on. And at the same time, the Jews were being invited into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth because they had a very primitive economy. It was primarily a barter economy. And they invited Jews in to provide the most basic economic services like minting coins. Many of the earliest coins from Poland actually have Hebrew writing on them. And also to provide basic credit in the form of money lending. You recall that the Jews had something of a monopoly for several centuries in that task. And so the Jews would literally go as an entire community to specific towns in Poland and Lithuania. They were typically granted Magdeburg-Recht, which was kind of communal rights. If a nobleman who owned an entire town would own the huge land holdings, which are called latifundia, but also he would own the wine presses, the olive presses, the bridges, the ponds, the hunting grounds, everything belonged to the nobleman. And so he would say to an entire Jewish community, listen, if you want to come over here and you want to settle in my town, I will give you the exclusive right to regulate, i.e. tax, all of my territories. And in exchange, I will give you privileges that you want. Like, for example, would you like to have a wall around your community? Ironically, Jews, with the major exceptions in Western Europe, Jews typically were the ones who built the walls around the communities to protect them from marauders. If you find that hard to believe, I will suggest you go visit places in Boca Raton, where they have these so-called gated communities. Right? It's exactly the same kind of thing. You want the gate and the security guard, right? And so Jews would go and settle as communities into these various towns, the Kehillah organization that we discussed last week. But this did not last, and in the 17th century, there was a huge upheaval, particularly in Ukraine, led by a man named Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who is the leader of the so-called Kozake, or Cossacks. Here's a picture, Ilya Repin's famous reply of the Zaporizhian Cossacks to the Sultan. In Ukrainian culture, the Cossacks were kind of, especially in the 17th century, they were sort of like outlaw heroes. They were runaways from regular society. They tended to live in faraway places like the rapids, the unnavigable rapids of the Dnipro River south of Kiev. And there they would engage in kind of like hero banditry. They would attack especially the Turks on the other side of the Black Sea. They would redeem Ukrainian captives, slaves that were taken by the Muslim Turks. And they would also kind of like, raid local settlements that were dominated by Polish noblemen. I forgot to mention that the arrangement that the Jews took in coming to a lot of these places involved their very uncomfortable position between the dominant local population made up of largely Ukrainian peasants and the owners of the land who were faraway noblemen living in Warsaw and Łódź and places like that. And so they were like, if you could imagine, you remember there were some riots in Los Angeles in the 1990s when the people in the South Central LA rose up. They didn't go and attack the white establishment in Bel Air and places like that. They attacked the local Korean groceries because it was only the Koreans who were like living there actually maintaining businesses. So the Jews were kind of like on the spot, and when an explosion occurred with the Cossacks leading it, the Jews suffered the brunt of it. The kind of jobs that Jews did at this time is that they were tax farming. This is a medieval practice that goes back many centuries in which, as I described, the nobleman would say, okay, these are my holdings, this is my land, and I estimate it will produce about 700 zloty a year. So you go out there and you provide me with 700 zloty. If you collect 900 zloty, then you get to keep what's left. You get to keep that extra 200. So that it was a profit incentive for the Jews to engage in whatever rights that the nobleman would give them to try and eke taxes out of the local population. This is not going to make them any friends with the local population, especially when the next year the nobleman said, oh, you showed up with 700 zloty right on time. It must have been too low a figure. This year I'd like you to please give me 800 zloty. And it never goes down. So this was kind of a difficult place. As Shimon Dubno put it, the Jews were like between the hammer and the anvil. The hammer were the Polish noblemen, the anvil were the Ukrainian peasants, and it eventually erupted in huge violence. The name for this form of tax farming over there was called arenda. I'm going to skip over that. And one other detail was significant. One of the monopolies that the Polish noblemen often gave to Jews was the right of propinacja, which means the exclusive right to sell and distribute alcohol. So that's where you often have Jews, even in the 21st century, there's an alcohol trade, Seagrams and organizations like this. It goes back really to this period in Jewish history where Jews who were, again, you'll recall they were urban, so they tended to have, more likely to have inns, whereas the Ukrainian peasants are spread out in the countryside, and so they would come into the villages to stay at the inn, and the inn was a place where you could drink alcohol. So just total it economically in your minds. The peasants come in, they don't have any cash because it's a very weak economy. They know they will eventually get some cash out of the ground when they sell their crops, but they want a beer now, and so they buy a beer on credit. Credit goes in a tab. Tab incurs interest, and then when time comes for the harvest, then all of a sudden they go into the inn to pay their tab and they see that it's really quite huge. And so that's going to include a lot of resentment. So what ended up happening was in 1648, there was a huge peasant uprising led by this Bohdan Khmelnytsky. The so-called Gzeras Tach V'Tat, the decree of 1648-49, was the Ukrainian peasantry's deep dissatisfaction with the status quo. It was primarily directed at the Polish noblemen, but they were very far away. So they wreaked their havoc primarily on the local Jewish population, also on Ukrainians who had converted to Catholicism because this was an Ukrainian Orthodox uprising, but it had a massive impact on Jews and continues to be remembered in the liturgy to this day. Shortly thereafter, perhaps as a result of the dispirited feeling of Jews after being attacked in this situation, a false messiah arose named Shabtai Tzvi. I would love to spend a lot more time talking about him, but I have to make it very brief. Shabtai Tzvi was a brilliant young man. In his youth, he was considered really quite a child prodigy. Tremendous singing voice, for example. He had lots of marriage proposals laid at his feet, but he was a bit of a loner. He liked to kind of like engage in mystical contemplation and things like that. And he probably suffered from some kind of mental illness. I'm not an expert, maybe something like bipolar disorder or something like that. He ran into an individual named Nathan of Gaza here. Oh, by the way, in this particular image, you can see that the artist is clearly not aware of Hebrew, but he's trying to, represent some Hebrew by putting it on the back of this pillar here. Shabbatai Tzvi actually was a Europe-wide sensation. Non-Jews were fascinated with the whole story of Shabbatai Tzvi, and so it appears in a lot of broadsheets from the time. But he ran into an individual named Nathan of Gaza, shown here, leading tens of thousands of people to Jerusalem, who essentially mounted a global campaign, or at least a Europe-wide campaign, that in fact Shabbatai Tzvi was the Jewish Redeemer, he was Mashiach, and that he was going to go to Jerusalem, take it back from the Ottomans, and initiate the Messianic period. He received a phenomenal amount of support. There were Jews all over Europe who were so excited. Finally, Mashiach, after 1,600 years of exile, finally we will return to Jerusalem. And they joined him. They sold their properties. They obviously had cents on the dollar, and they went to follow him, as you can see from this picture here. And finally, they made their way to Constantinople, and the Sultan was not necessarily impressed with his claims. He said, I have a counteroffer. How about I let you keep your head if you convert to Islam? And Shabbatai Tzvi agreed, and he accepted the deal. He converted to Islam. The vast majority of his Jewish followers were completely devastated by this betrayal of the movement, although a small number of them decided that, wait a minute, this must be part of the divine plan. If Shabbatai Tzvi is in fact Mashiach, and he's become a Muslim, must mean that we should also become Muslims, and that's how it will bring about the end of days. And so they converted to Islam as well. They are called the Dunmeh, and there are significant pockets of them even today in Syria and Turkey, these former followers of Shabbatai Tzvi. But it led to still more of a depression, like a Europe-wide depression among Jews after this hugely popular Messianic movement failed. Many scholars relate these two events, that is, the Ukrainian uprising of 1648-49, the failed Messiah Shabbatai Tzvi, to the growth of the Hasidic movement. Other scholars feel that that's in fact an unfair comparison, because Hasidism represents a tremendously new and bright movement all on its own. It's not exclusively a reaction to these earlier devastating events. Basically, what is Hasidism? This is a picture of a well that exists in Ukraine that many locals believe was actually dug by the founder of the Hasidic movement himself, the famous Israel ben Elazar, the Baal Shem Tov himself. And this is kind of like what Hasidism represents. It's a drink of cool, fresh well water. It's something new, taking from the deep sources that we saw in the Arizal and in many other sources, and giving new energy to Judaism. Let's try and understand a little bit of the roots behind it. One part of the roots associated with the development of Hasidism in the 18th century is the fact that many Jews, particularly in the southern regions of Eastern Europe, felt that they were intellectually disenfranchised. The world of Talmud study among Jews valorized and prioritized intellectual acuity above everything else. The idea that the only way you could really achieve status in the Jewish world, actually let me back up for a second. Historically, there are three ways to achieve status in the Jewish world, and this applies universally. The first is called yichus, which means family lineage. If you come from important people, if your father, your grandfather, your mother, your bobby, and so on, if they're important people, okay, so you're important because you have yichus. The second thing, and this is no longer important, but if you have money, right? If you have money, you get status. We don't pay attention to money anymore. But the only democratic way to get status in Jewish society is learning. That's the only avenue to status that is traditionally available to everyone, right? It's as if the Torah is lying in the street. Anyone who wants it can pick it up. And the Lithuanians in particular, this is in Northern Europe, were the paradigm of the intellectual elite. The Lithuanians still have a strong influence on contemporary society. You can usually recognize a Litvak, a person from Lithuanian extraction, because they tend to be humorous, rather good-looking, fine fashion sense. And that's where all the great minds were, the great writers, the great thinkers. They were all up in the north. And the poor peasant Jews in the south, beat up after the Khmelnytsky Revolution, beat up by their failed messiah Shabtai Tzvi, they had nothing, and they felt so disenfranchised. The Baal Shem Tov, active in Podolia and in southern Poland, really began to say, no, your spirituality in itself has tremendous value. Again, drawing from the Arizal, the tiniest little movements, the recital of psalms, the extending of kindness, fellowship, singing, dancing, drinking, all of these things imbued with a love of God can have phenomenal spiritual and cosmic impact. And that's really what was the main message of Hasidism. There was also an economic factor. There's a particular scholar in Israel who has pioneered the study of this. His name is Dinor, in which we should understand that, just as I mentioned earlier, the Polish nobleman literally owned the town. It also meant that, strange as it might sound, the Polish nobleman had the right to name the town rabbi. And so if the Polish nobleman, who is not an expert in Talmudic law, can name the town rabbi, then it's something open to bribery and corruption. And so what happened over the course of the 15th, 16th, 17th century is that, charlatans would simply invest money in the nobleman. They would get the position of chief rabbi of a given town. They would collect all of the related taxes, such as the korobka, a candle tax, a kosher meat tax, all of these things. And it was a shtela, it was a position, it was something that you could do as a job. This did not necessarily satisfy the spiritual yearnings of the local population. So you had developed these sometimes charlatans themselves, these so-called Balei Shem, who were usually amulet makers, who were charismatic, who were good communicators, who began to attract around themselves people who needed that spiritual lift, and these people who are not necessarily rabbis by the traditional definition of the term were able to provide it. The greatest of them was the Baal Shem Tov. This is actually a tax record from Medjugorje, which shows, as a highlighted thing, a colleague of mine, a senior colleague named Moshe Rossman, actually went to Poland when the Soviet Union fell apart and went into the archives. He was one of the first people to actually discover actual evidence of the life of the Baal Shem Tov. And here you can see in the tax records, there's a reference to Baal Shem, which is the Baal Shem Tov himself. And he found a lot of amazing things about him. The Baal Shem Tov, the word means the amulet maker. Baal Shem means master of the name, i.e. the name of God. And people would request amulets for health and for livelihood and for finding a spouse and so on. He was not like those snake oil salesmen. He was the Baal Shem Tov. He was the good amulet maker. And he generated a movement of excitement that spread throughout the region. Here is a map that shows you over the 18th and 19th century, the spread of the many different sects. Here's Lithuania up in the north, right, where the good-looking, intelligent people live. And then you have Poland, Hungary, and Ukraine. And the epicenter is right around here in the Carpathian mountain region, where Hasidism just takes off. And there's clearly a geographic divide. Ironically, one of the most well-known Hasidic sects, the so-called Chabad movement, which is taken from the Arizal's 3 Sefirot, Chokhmah, Bina, Dat, is actually a Lithuanian movement. It's one of the more intellectual of the movements. And these movements, although totally devastated in the Holocaust, live on today. If you look at this map of the holy city of Brooklyn, and you can see, because the Hasidim overwhelmingly speak Yiddish as their first language, you can see massive collections of these. This map shows children aged 5 to 17 who speak Yiddish at home. This map is from the year 2000. You can see huge concentrations here in Borough Park, in Williamsburg, and in Crown Heights. And there's also right here, that's where I work, this little dot right here. Okay. So the Hasidic movement has a huge impact, but they have massive conflict because the Lithuanian Jews are not standing still throughout all of this. And they begin to oppose the new Hasidic movement. Hasidism, the word Hasid is, of course, from Hebrew, and it means pious, but in this context, it means someone who does more than is required. more than is necessary, going beyond the letter of the law. For example, just off the top of my head, the Torah says it is forbidden to shave with a razor the sides of your forehead, right? So, but you are allowed to cut your hair with scissors. So the Litvaks will, of course, cut their hair short on the sides like this. But the Hasidim would say, you know what? If I can't cut it with a razor, I'm not going to cut it at all. And I'm going to let my hair grow long and beautiful. And that's why they get the peyot, so-called corners, because it's a way of saying I'm going to do more than is required. I know I can cut my peyot, but you know what? For me, I'm so proud of it, I'm just going to keep it like that. So it's ironic because, of course, now if you go to places like Lakewood, which are strongholds of the Litvaks, they will also grow peyos because, you know, the Hasidim now have influence on the Mitnagdim. The Mitnagdim all have influence on the Hasidim. The term Mitnagdim or Misnagdim means opponents because they opposed the Hasidic innovations. The derogatory form, by the way, and I have a lot of, I know it sounds funny, I have a lot of Hasidic, some of my best friends are Hasidic, but when the derogatory is snag in modern American usage, you know, someone's a snag, it means he's a misnaged, he is one of those Lithuanians. But anyway, the Misnagdim, whose greatest leader was the Vilna Gaon, pictured here, a tremendous genius living in Lithuania, although his particular opposition is not at all clear. This seems to have been something that was much more popular among his followers. They opposed the Hasidim primarily because there was a lot of antinomian behavior going on. What do I mean by antinomian? The Hasidim were not as strict about certain halachic norms than the Misnagdim were. Like, for example, we have traditionally 3 times of prayer, right? Shacharis in the morning, Mincha in the afternoon, and Maariv at night. And the Misnagdim will actually calculate when these prayers may be said, right? We know exactly what time the sun goes down. You can say Mincha a certain time, Maariv after that, there's certain breaks and so on, and we're very particular about it. But the Hasidim would say, come on, seriously, does God want you to drag yourself out of bed when it's cold outside and you know you're hungry and you're not going to be motivated? God wants you to have a good night's sleep. He wants you to be prepared. Go to shul later and daven like a mensch, daven properly. Similarly, the Hasidim, the Misnagdim will not eat before prayers. How can you feed your body when you have to show gratitude to God? And the Hasidim say, is that the way you're going to show gratitude? You're going to go to shul, and we know you're saying the words, but you're really thinking about kichel. You're really thinking about the herring. So no, eat a little bit before you go to shul. And so there are all these kind of like what the Misnagdim regard as halachic compromises. The Hasidim say, no, this is a preparation. This is what you need to be able to pray properly. And both groups thought that the other were crazy. There are a lot of other elements going on here. Let us not forget the economic motives, because if you have the town rabbi with his shul, and they daven Shacharis at, let's say, 8 a.m., and then you have this charismatic group on the side that's a breakaway minyan, and they're Hasidim, so they want to daven at 10 a.m., well, you know what? They're going to need another building eventually. They're going to need their own congregation. So there's economic stresses as well between this incipient new group. Which reminds me of a joke. I can't help but tell it to you. Sorry. I'm sorry. I can't. I'll say it very fast. It's not an offensive joke. First 3 clergymen in outer space. Have you heard this before? Okay, joke goes like this. First 3 clergymen in outer space, they get on the space shuttle, they orbit the world a few times, and they come back down, and the journalists all come up to them, and they say to the Catholic priest, what did you think? He says, I thought of the immensity of God's creation. Then they go to the Protestant minister, and he says, I thought of how tiny humanity is. And they ask the rabbi, and he says, who had time to think? Shacharis, Mincha, Maariv. Shacharis, Mincha, Maariv. Okay, sorry. Now, the conflict between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim was really quite bitter at the end of the 18th century. It was like they were literally fist fighting with each other. They were literally denouncing each other to the Russian authorities, and the Russian authorities were generally very pleased to throw this or that Hasidic leader into prison. In fact, as I'm talking right now, today is Chai Elul. It happens to be a very important date in the Hasidic calendar. And that's why if you go, Chabad has all these dates throughout the year where they have celebrations because this is another day when one of their leaders was released from prison, because they tend to get thrown in prison a lot, and quite often it was the Misnagdim in the early period that threw them in there. But both groups realized by about the year 1815 that they had a far larger challenge with the so-called Maskilim. The Maskilim are the followers of the Jewish Enlightenment, which was called the Haskalah. And this was a movement that was spearheaded first by this man here in the red coat, Moses Mendelssohn, who said, you know what? It's time now for Jews to break out of their intellectual ghettos and join world society. There's no reason why Jews cannot participate in the broader cultural currents that surround us. And Jews should not regard themselves as being somehow foreigners living in this society, even though many countries literally consider Jews foreign residents, like Russia. Until 1917, you could be living in Russia for 1,000 years. Your passport would say inozemnych, foreigner. It's time for Jews to regard themselves as part of the societies in which they lived. Many of these early Maskilim said the only way we can do this is by jettisoning our Jewish practice, by jettisoning our, for example, why have Shabbos on Saturday? Why have our Sabbath on Saturday when, after all, the rest of the world does it on Sunday? Let's just move it to Sunday, and this was like unheard of. And all these foods that we can't eat, but that separates us from our surrounding society. We should give up on that. We should eat the same things everybody else eats, the national foods and so on. So the Hasidim and the Misnagdim kind of made a truce that has held pretty much until the present day, where they said we have a much larger fight with the Haskalah, with the Maskilim. To give an example, one of the biggest fights between the Maskilim and the Misnagdim and the Hasidim was over some tiny rules of how an animal is kosher slaughtered. That had to do with the sharpness of the knife. And they argued bitterly about it until they realized the Maskilim are saying, we don't have to keep kosher at all. So if the fight is over keeping kosher at all, then they've got to work out their differences about the shchita method and move on. So that's ultimately, the Maskilim had a phenomenal impact in Western Europe in particular, but it was not able to penetrate the same way in Eastern Europe because the Hasidim and the Misnagdim closed ranks. Okay, so let's run to that Western Europe now, and we have to go to the great story of emancipation, Jewish emancipation, which was a drama that occupied Western Europe for about 200 years. The Jews were still living in a kind of medieval format. The Kehillah leadership is designed, as we discussed last week, designed for a medieval kind of feudal society in which people lived in communities and they are defined by their community. They're not defined by their profession, by their geographic location and so on, certainly not defined by their confession. But as modernity wore on and the feudal patterns of Europe were country by country abandoned, the Maskilim argued that in fact Jews should be released from their medieval corporate state and they should be allowed to be regular citizens like everyone else. In France, this happened all of a sudden in 1791. With the French Revolution 2 years earlier that proclaimed liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? Liberty, equality, and siblinghood for all, I shouldn't say siblinghood, I should say brotherhood, because when they suggested, there was a woman who suggested you mean women too, they said, no, we're not talking about women, only men are equal, women are not. The Jews said, well, when you say all people living in France are equal, that's us too. And the French thought about it. They were really not comfortable with it. But in 1790, they said, okay, we're going to accept those Sephardic Jews who live in Bordeaux and Bayonne because they tended to be more acculturated. They spoke French. They wore French clothes and so on. The Ashkenazim living in Alsace-Lorraine on the border with Germany was a little bit harder. But in 1791, they said, okay, you Jews, you can be French as well. This was a shock to society because, again, the Jews who were an intellectual powerhouse because they were overwhelmingly literate, overwhelmingly numerate, They had tremendous experience with financial services and so on. All of a sudden, they were released from whatever anti-Semitic restrictions were in place, and they were able to get into all aspects of not only the economy, but the culture at the same time. So many protested against this, and in the early 19th century, the Emperor Napoleon said, okay, you know what, we're going to solve this once and for all. Let's ask the Jews what they are all about. Is there an organization of Jews that we can ask as to what they want to do with their citizenship? And people said to Napoleon, well, they used to have a state, and they had a grand court of 71 judges called the Sanhedrin, but it hasn't sat in 1900 years. He says, that doesn't matter to me at all. I'm Napoleon. Reconvene the Sanhedrin. And so he sent out this message that shocked the entire Jewish world. The Sanhedrin, the great grand court of the Jews, would be amassed in Paris under the leadership of this rabbi, David Sinsheim, who was actually a very well-respected rabbi of the time. This was a special kind of celebratory hat that he wore to as the head of the Sanhedrin. And Napoleon asked the Sanhedrin, okay, I have 12 questions that will determine your position in French society. And these were essentially questions that we have lived with those answers ever since. Because Napoleon said to them, do you consider yourself primarily French or primarily Jewish? And essentially they said, French, because they know who we're talking to. They're talking to Napoleon. If it said primarily Jewish, then he could have said, you know what, this is all a mistake. You guys should be out of here. And they flubbed a lot of answers like, is it permitted in your religion for a Jewish person to marry a non-Jew, which is not permitted? But they said, well, you know, technically, oh, look at the time already. And they kind of like they met because he wanted to make sure that they would ultimately assimilate. And so in the end, Napoleon said, okay, fine. We're going to verify the emancipation that we granted years earlier. We're expecting no dual loyalties. So by the way, if we fight against Germany, where there are a lot of Jews there, how will you fight? And they said famously, jusqu'à la mort. We will fight to the death. You know, and French Jews in general have been fairly patriotic to their country. The Jews were so grateful for this that they did things like mint this coin, which shows on the left Napoleon, and on the right, here's Napoleon as literally the lawgiver, as so to speak, God, because this Moses here is clearly genuflecting and giving obeisance to Napoleon as he accepts the two tablets of the law. But this essentially charted the role of emancipation. In the Russian Empire, it didn't go this smoothly at all. The Russian Empire was, in the 19th century, determined to try and get rid of the Jewish people primarily by three methods. 1/3 they anticipated would emigrate, another third would assimilate, and another third would die. The idea was simply to get rid of the Jewish people, a big undigestible mass living in Russia. And one of the most cruel aspects of this was Nicholas I imposed a so-called Cantonist decree. He realized, he was a military man, he realized that one of the best ways to assimilate the Jews was to force them into the army. And he knew that the regular age of conscription of 18 was too late. And so he lowered the age of conscription to the age of 12. And these children would be taken at the age of 12. They would spend 6 years in a reform school called a canton, and then they would spend 25 years in the Russian army. It was like essentially taking them away from the Jewish community forever. And what was perhaps most diabolical, because the Russian government was really quite inept, they didn't have the bureaucracy in place to handle it, so he said to the Kehillah, the leadership of each Jewish community, I would like you to choose the recruits. When we come through in October for the number of recruits that we demanded, we want you, Jewish leaders, to provide those children for us. And that meant that the Jewish Kehillah leadership, the federation leadership, if you will, the rabbis, had to decide which children would go away for 36 odd years. This was a tremendously devastating move that tore apart the Jewish community. In some cases, we have examples where the leadership actually employed professional kidnappers called chappers, who would go in the dead of night before the Russians came and would steal children from their beds to deliver them to the Russians. You can be assured that the children of the wealthy, the children of the powerful, were not sent off to the cantons. It was children of widows, children of impoverished individuals, and this created a huge rift within the Jewish community where a whole generation of Jews lost confidence in their leadership. And it would eventually play out, let's skip through this here, in the Russian Revolution, when individuals like Leon Trotsky had no confidence whatsoever in the leadership and wanted a revolution. One of the lesser known reasons why Leon Trotsky fought against Russia so badly was because it was virtually impossible to get a decent haircut anywhere. Okay. Yeah, thank you. I tried a little harder with that one. Okay. In Germany, the emancipation, and by the way, emancipation would only come with the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, which we will discuss next week. In Germany, unlike France, they went back and forth several times. Certain parts of Germany said yes, other parts said no. They had an internal revolution, then the revolution failed, and Jews were struggling for the entire century to try and get emancipation. For some, like Abraham Geiger, who was generally understood as the founder of the Reform movement, the idea was we have to prove to the Germans that we are also German. And so therefore we should adopt more German manners. We should adopt the German language. We should reform our synagogue so it looks more like a church. We should try to do things that make us fit in with the Germans, a kind of a slavish, almost aping of German norms that was very characteristic of the period. Others, like Zacharias Frankel, who is associated with what we would call in America the conservative movement, said, you know, you are going too far. Taking Hebrew out of the liturgy, that's a bridge too far, we're not going to do it. But Orthodox thinkers, such as Samson Raphael Hirsch, said, you know what? We are not going to push away modernity. Jews are going to do this whether we like it or not, so we have to find a way to preserve Orthodox identity by deciding what exactly is required and what exactly is custom and threading that needle. He's associated really the founding of what we would call today modern Orthodoxy. Many felt that he was insufficiently from-looking, insufficiently Orthodox-looking, so they tended to issue these pictures a little bit differently, even in his own time. This is a well-known phenomenon with photography. We tend to from people up over time. At any rate, they are operating against the backdrop of increasing anti-Semitism. In fact, the word anti-Semitism at this time was coined by Wilhelm Marr, shown here on the left. Wilhelm Marr wanted to invent a more polite term for what was called Judenhass, or Judenfeinde, which means basically Jew hatred. And so he said, I'm not against Jews, I'm against Semitism. What is Semitism? He borrowed from linguistic theory to say, oh, there are these people called Semites, which includes Arabs, but he wasn't really thinking of them. These people called Semites who are locked in a world Jewish conspiracy to dominate Europe. And I'm against that. Hence the term anti-Semitismus, which originally was used as kind of a badge of honor. You would say you're anti-Semite proudly. Of course, with the Holocaust, that term lost its glamour temporarily. Some figures like Heinrich von Treitschke, who we spoke about briefly in the first lecture, opposed the Jews, and particularly the work of Heinrich Gretz, the great historian, and he coined the term that would later become famous under Hitler. This term, moving forward, let me just see, it should zoom in. Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. We have any problems here in German society, it's because of the Jews. We'll obviously return to this, God willing, next week. Let us just conclude. It looks like I've lost my clicker, so I'll have to use my finger here. When we get to the end of the 19th century, there is a major seam drawn with a wave of pogroms that literally lasts 3 years in the Russian Empire. The lighter color in this map here shows the so-called Pale of Settlement, where Jews were allowed to live in Russia. And as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, Jews are generally able to tolerate a degree of anti-Semitism as long as they live in the Rechtsstaat, as long as they know that the government will basically follow its own laws. With these pogroms, which were not devastating by 20th century standards. By one count, only 46 people were killed, unfortunately, but only 46 people were killed over 3 years. But what really impacted the Jews was the fact that, hey, We keep having these pogroms day after day. Where is the government stopping it? Why is this violence happening? And so Jews got up and said, we have to change things now. And these things came together as they created 5 distinct strategies for survival, one of which was the mass migration to these shores. 1.75 million came between 1881 and 1917, and everybody else went to countries where they had universal health care. But they developed 5 strategies for modernity that we will discuss next week. Just to list them quickly: emigration, the most traditional and widely followed strategy. Secondly, Zionism, socialism, something called diaspora nationalism, and the 5th is renewed traditionalism. All of these things, God willing, will be the center of our discussion next week. I would like to conclude by reminding you that in the first lecture, I wanted to give you one takeaway message. And the message that I had when we looked at the Jews in the ancient period was that when you look at the nature of the Jewish narrative at that point, I think the big takeaway is that the Jewish people are resilient. The Jewish people are able to absorb phenomenal attacks on their body politic and still survive. When we looked at the medieval period last week, which involved tremendous upheavals and challenges, we see that the Jewish people were resourceful. They found new strategies to be able to endure those challenges and not only survive, but in fact, in many cases, even thrive. So the takeaway that I'd like to suggest for today's class is that when we look at the modern people, we see that the Jewish people are renewing, in the sense that they are finding new ways to exist. I wanted to say dynamic, in the sense that they're constantly moving. They're a flowing river, but dynamic starts with a D instead of an R. So I chose renewing. And I think that's the takeaway message for tonight. I want to thank you very much for your endurance. And God willing, we'll reconvene next week.